The Infrastructure Playbook: How a Rewards Company Becomes a Platform. The strategy is already decided. Every prior study in this series reached the same conclusion from a different direction. HeyMax's durable business is not the consumer app. It is the infrastructure underneath, selling miles as a service to banks, fintechs, merchants, and coalitions, where the company sets the price instead of accepting one. So this study does not re-argue the strategy. It asks the operator's question instead: what does it actually take to be that business, and what is missing today? The answer came in 3 layers. First, there is a well-documented playbook. Stripe, Twilio, Plaid, Marqeta, and Adyen all productized in public, and their regulatory filings record exactly what they shipped, in what order, and what it cost. Second, there is a market with peculiar physics. Enterprise loyalty has no public price anchor anywhere between about $2,400 a year and a 7-figure bank contract. And in Singapore, the service level is not negotiated with the buyer at all. It is set by the regulator. Third, and least comfortable, there is the mirror. A live audit of HeyMax's own public developer and trust surface, conducted for this study on the 4th of August, 2026. It scored 0 out of 12 on the developer experience bar and 0 out of 9 on the trust surface. One finding reframes everything, and it belongs up front. The right comparator for HeyMax is not Stripe. It is Ascenda, which is HeyMax's supplier. Ascenda publishes 143 documented pages, a live status page, security certifications, and 66 pre-answered security questionnaire items. One of the components on its public status page is the transfer interface that HeyMax's own redemptions run through. The supplier publishes uptime for the rail. The customer publishes nothing to its own customers. Ground rules unchanged. Filings are quoted from filings. The audit is dated and reproducible. Estimates and reasoning are labeled, and the last chapter says what would prove this wrong. Let's begin. Chapter 1: The 8-to-1 ratio. Let me start with why the infrastructure business is worth the trouble at all, because the market sizing here turns out to be unusually revealing. At HeyMax's Series A in January of 2026, the lead investor's stated thesis was this: more than 40% of total card revenues, over $100 billion globally, is spent on loyalty and consumer rewards. I want to be careful with that number. It is an investor claim with no published methodology behind it, and I am labeling it as such before I use it. But even labeled, it is worth holding up against something we can actually check, which is the size of the loyalty software market. 3 separate vendor estimates put that software market at roughly $13 billion. The individual figures are $12.9 billion, $13.6 billion, and $15.2 billion, all for the year 2025. And here is the detail that tells you how much confidence to place in any of them. Their forecasts for the early 2030s diverge by a factor of 2.5. 3 firms looking at the same industry cannot agree, within a factor of 2.5, on what it will be worth by the start of the next decade. That is the quality of the forecasting in this category, and you should price your certainty accordingly. Now put the 2 numbers next to each other. Roughly $8 of rewards flow for every $1 of rewards software. 8-to-1. That ratio is the entire strategic argument for how a company in this market ought to get paid. If you sell licenses, you are fishing in the $13 billion pool. If you get paid on the flow, a share of every mile issued and every mile redeemed, you are fishing in the $100 billion one. Same product, same customers, an order of magnitude difference in the size of the opportunity, decided almost entirely by the shape of the invoice. And this is not a theoretical point, because every serious incumbent has already made the move. In October of 2024, Ascenda abolished its setup fees and its platform fees entirely, declaring that it charges, in its own words, only for content and growth outcomes actually delivered. Its chief executive described this as a shift from delivering loyalty software to delivering loyalty ROI. Read that as what it is. The strongest player in the region has voluntarily surrendered the safest revenue line it had, the fee you collect before you deliver anything, in order to stand in the flow instead. So much for the size of the prize. Now the number that sets the ceiling on the middle of this market, and it is a sobering one. Points International is the only points exchange business that has ever published audited financials. In its final year as a public company, it earned roughly $370 million of revenue at a gross margin of 14%. It then sold to Plusgrade for $385 million. That is about 1 times revenue and about 7.5 times gross profit. That is what pure exchange infrastructure is worth when it has no consumer demand attached to it. It is also, I would argue, the single most useful number to have in your pocket when an investor asks why HeyMax should not simply become a points transfer utility and be done with it. The answer is that the market has already priced that business in cash, and the price was about 1 times revenue. 2 transactions from this year bracket the valuation range, and they make the point far more sharply than any market forecast can. Adyen agreed to buy Talon 1 for €750 million against roughly 60 million of expected recurring revenue. That is about 12.5 times. 6 months earlier, Capillary bought SessionM from MasterCard for $20 million against 35 million of recurring revenue. That is about 0.57 times. And SessionM was not a nobody. It arrived with a roster of more than 40 Fortune 500 class customers. Same category, same year, a 22-fold spread in the multiple. I keep coming back to that pair because the conclusion is unavoidable and it contradicts how most companies in this space pitch themselves. Logos are not pricing power. Growth inside somebody's must-have stack is. SessionM had the customer list. Talon 1 had the position inside a payment stack that Adyen needed. The market paid 22 times more for the second thing. There is one more structural fact I want to put in front of you, and I think it should shape the roadmap more than anything else in this chapter, because it operates on a clock that nobody in the company controls. There are only a handful of issuer processor distribution slots on Earth. An issuer processor is the company that runs the plumbing behind a card program. If you are a fintech launching a card, you sit on one of these platforms, and 2 of those slots have already been taken. Galileo paired with Ascenda in February of 2025. Marqeta paired with Card in April of 2026. In each case, the processor reached the same conclusion. Rewards had become a required feature of any card program, but Rewards was not a business the processor wanted to be in itself. So it picked one loyalty partner and made that partner the default for every card program running on its platform. Think about what that means for the winner. One integration, and you are standing in front of every program that processor serves without ever having sold to any of them individually. It is the highest leverage go-to-market move available anywhere in this market. It is also winner take one. There is exactly one default slot per processor, and once it is filled for years. The shelf is emptying. That is the strategic clock running underneath everything else in this study, and unlike the market forecasts, it is not an estimate. It is a countable number of remaining seats. Chapter 2: What infrastructure actually means. Before I get to the case studies, I want to set the bar because the phrase, "we have an API," and the phrase, "we are infrastructure," are separated by about a dozen specific artifacts, and the gap between them is measurable. That is the useful thing here. It is not a matter of taste. You can go and look. Let me take the developer experience surface first. This list is not my invention. It is assembled from what the successful platforms actually shipped in public, where anyone can still inspect it today. You need public API documentation with a real endpoint reference, meaning every call, every parameter, every response. You need a sandbox with test credentials that work without a sales call, so that a curious engineer at 11 at night can try your product without asking anyone's permission. You need SDKs in the languages your buyers actually use. You need explicit API versioning with a documented deprecation policy. You need idempotency on every mutating call. You need signed webhooks. You need a public changelog. You need your error codes documented, each one with a remediation, so a developer who hits an error can fix it without opening a ticket. You need your rate limits published. And you need a quick start that carries a developer from signing up to a first successful call without ever speaking to a human being. 2 of those deserve translation for anyone who has not built payment systems. Idempotency means that if a client sends the same request twice, because the network dropped and the client retried, the operation still happens exactly once. In a payments or points context, that is the difference between issuing 100,000 miles and issuing 200,000 miles because a connection blinked. It is the property that lets a bank's engineers sleep. Signed webhooks are the same discipline running in the other direction. When your platform calls back to notify a customer that something has happened, you cryptographically sign that message, so the receiving system can prove it came from you and not from somebody impersonating you. Without it, every notification you send is an attack surface. Now, of everything on that list, the artifact that most clearly proves a company intends to be depended upon is versioning discipline, and Stripes is the gold standard. It is worth stating precisely. Stripe has shipped almost 100 backwards incompatible upgrades since 2011 without breaking a single existing integration. The way it does this is to pin every account to a dated version, and then transform responses backwards through what it calls version change modules, so that an integration written years ago receives exactly the shape of data it was written against, even though the underlying system has moved on 100 times since. That is not a documentation nicety. That is an engineering commitment paid for continuously, forever. And it is the thing that lets a bank build on you. A bank is not buying your current API, it is buying a promise about the next 7 years of your API. Now the trust surface, which is a shorter list and, for anyone selling into regulated buyers, considerably more decisive. You need a public status page with component-level uptime, a security page setting out your practices and listing your subprocessors, meaning every third party that touches customer data. SOC2 Type 2, ISO 27001, where the buyer requires it. A penetration test attestation. A published uptime service level agreement with service credits attached, because a promise with no penalty behind it is not really a promise. A data processing agreement. A trust center, where the report itself sits behind a simple click through rather than behind a sales conversation. And named security contacts, so a researcher or a customer knows exactly who to call. 9 items. 3 of them deserve particular emphasis because they determine the order in which you do everything else. First, the status page is the cheapest procurement artifact in existence. It is about a week of work. And it is the very first thing a vendor risk analyst looks for, because it is the fastest available signal of whether a vendor treats reliability as an obligation owed to customers or as a private internal matter. 1 week of engineering buys you a permanent answer to a question every enterprise buyer asks. Second, and this is the one that governs the entire calendar, SOC2 Type 2 cannot be bought quickly. Let me be precise about the economics, because the money is genuinely not the problem. Auditor fees run $15,000 to $60,000. All in first-year costs, including tooling and internal time, run $30,000 to $150,000. Set against a bank contract, those numbers are trivial. You would spend that on a trade show booth. The problem is time. The Type 2 observation window is 3 to 12 months, and it cannot be compressed. That is the entire point of a Type 2. A Type 1 says your controls were designed correctly on a given day. A Type 2 says an auditor watched them operate over a period of time. You cannot pay money to shorten a period of time. Budget 9 to 12 months from the decision to the report in your hand. So the money is not the barrier. The calendar is. And the calendar is the one barrier an incumbent has already paid years ago, which means every month you delay starting is a month you can never recover relative to them. Third, and I include this because it is genuinely funny as well as genuinely instructive. The two largest companies selling trust and compliance automation, the companies whose entire product is helping you prove that you are trustworthy, both refuse to publish their own prices. Meanwhile, Stripe has published 2.9% plus 30 cents on its front page since 2011. The industry that sells trust has not adopted the transparency that creates it. Hold on to that, because the next chapter is about exactly that gap, and about why the first company in loyalty willing to close it acquires an advantage that costs almost nothing to obtain. Chapter 3, Stripe's lesson, Publish the Price. The first playbook is the simplest of the set, and also the most counter-cultural for any company selling into enterprises. Put the price on the front page. Stripe launched in 2011 with 2.9% plus 30 cents. No monthly fees, no setup fees, published where anyone could read it. That includes competitors, it includes procurement teams, and it includes people who were never going to buy anything. Adyen, which is the most profitable company in this entire cohort, does the same thing in a different shape. Adyen prices on what the industry calls interchange plus, which means it passes through the underlying card scheme costs at cost, and then adds its own fixed margin on top. That margin is 13 cents per transaction. And it states explicitly in writing that there are no monthly fees, no setup fees, no integration fees, and no closure fees. That last one is worth pausing on. No closure fees means it costs you nothing to leave. Now look at what that pricing posture has produced. Adyen ran a 50% margin on earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization in the first half of 2025, while processing over €1 trillion of payment volume in 2024. Read that alongside Stripe, and you arrive at a finding that I think belongs on the wall of every pricing meeting in this industry. The company charging the least per transaction is the most profitable one in the group, not the one extracting the most from each customer. The one that made itself the easiest thing in the market to start using and the easiest thing to stop using, and then collected the volume that followed. Now hold all of that against the loyalty market, where this study found something genuinely remarkable. Nobody publishes a price, not one of them. I went through the field vendor by vendor. Talon 1, Antavo, Open Loyalty, Loyalty Juggernaut, Comark, Epsilon, every single one of them publishes a pricing model. They will happily tell you that they charge based on data volume or on customer activity or on monthly active members, and every single one of them publishes $0 figures. You can learn the shape of the meter. You cannot learn the rate. Public pricing in this category exists in exactly one place, which is the small merchant tier sold through Shopify, and it caps out at about $199 a month. That is the ceiling of everything a buyer can see without talking to a salesperson. Above $199 a month, the published record of what loyalty technology costs simply stops. So here is the structure of this market in a single sentence. Between roughly $2,400 a year and a seven-figure bank contract, there is no public price anchor anywhere in this industry. That is a range spanning 3 orders of magnitude in which no buyer can calibrate anything at all without first booking a meeting. Now, that is either a norm to respect or an opening to exploit. The platform record suggests the latter, but with an important refinement, and I want to be careful here, because the refinement is where most people get this wrong. The lesson is not publish your enterprise contract. Nobody is asking you to put your bank pricing on the internet, and doing so would be commercially foolish. The lesson is publish a price for the first dollar. Publish what it costs to issue the first 100,000 miles through the API self-serve, paid with a card. No conversation required. Then negotiate the points economics privately with anyone doing real volume, exactly as you do today. Why does that work? Because a published entry price is a trust artifact even for the customers who will never pay it. It signals 3 things at once. It signals that the product is real because you cannot put a price on something that does not ship. It signals that you understand your own economics well enough to commit to a number in public. And it signals to the buyer that they are not about to be discovery priced, which is the enterprise buyer's oldest and most reasonable fear. That is the suspicion that the quote arriving in their inbox is a function of how much budget the salesperson thinks they have, rather than of what the thing actually costs. That third signal is the valuable one, and it is free. There is a corollary that comes straight out of the playbook, and it is the piece companies most often skip. Define the explicit crossover. Write down, in advance and in writing, the volume at which self-serve ends and sales begins. Twilio disclosed exactly this structure in its filings. Self-serve prepaid accounts, where a developer puts in a card and starts consuming immediately, graduating into committed 12-month contracts invoiced monthly in arrears. 2 populations, 2 commercial motions, 1 product underneath both. And critically, Twilio reported those 2 populations separately. It did not blend them into a single revenue number and call the result growth. It told the market how much of the business was self-serve and how much was committed, which meant an outside investor could watch the machine working, developers arriving at the bottom, enterprises emerging at the top. That reporting discipline is not an accounting preference. It is the thing that makes the entire motion legible to the people who set your valuation. If you do not separate the 2 populations, nobody outside the company can tell whether you are running a platform or running a project business with an API attached to it. And, as we will see later, nobody inside the company can tell either. Which brings me directly to what Twilio actually measured, and to the single number that carried its equity story for a decade. Chapter 4, Twilio's lesson, the expansion engine. Twilio's registration statement contains what I think is the single most useful sentence in this entire literature about how developer platforms grow. Here it is. We acquire developers like consumers and enable them to spend like enterprises. That is the whole motion in 12 words. Cheap, self-serve, high-volume acquisition at the top of the funnel. Enterprise-scale consumption at the bottom of it. You market like a consumer company and you get paid like an enterprise one, and the same customer travels the entire distance without ever being handed off to a different product. The metric that captures whether this is actually happening is dollar-based net expansion. The idea is simple. Take the customers you already had a year ago. Ignore every new customer you have won since. How much more are those same customers spending with you this year than last year? If the answer is more than 100%, your existing base is growing on its own, and every new customer you win lands on top of that. If it is below 100%, you are running up a down escalator, and the sales team's first job each year is simply to replace what leaked out. Twilio disclosed this number across 13 years of filings, which is an unusually long public record for any single operating metric, and the series is worth reading out in full because the shape of it matters more than any single point in it. 170% in 2013, 155% in 2015, 128% in 2017, 137% in 2020, 103% in 2023, 108% in 2025. Read that curve carefully because it corrects a misconception that is extremely widespread and, in my experience, almost never challenged in a board meeting. Investors routinely quote a band of 130 to 155% net expansion as though it were a property of API businesses. A law of the category. Build an API business, get those numbers. It is not a law, it was an era. It decayed as the company matured, and it decayed for a specific and understandable reason. Growth shifted away from expansion inside existing accounts and toward acquisition of new ones. Both of those produce revenue. Only one of them earns the infrastructure multiple, because only one of them tells an investor that the product becomes more valuable to a customer over time without anybody having to sell to them again. The cohort data shows why it mattered so much while it lasted. Twilio's 2014 cohort, meaning only the customers it acquired during that year, produced $6.4 million of revenue in 2014. The following year, that same fixed group of customers produced $21.4 million. 237% growth from a closed set of customers with no new logos at all. Think about what that does to a sales plan. It means the sales team's job in year 2 is not to replace year 1's revenue. Year 1's revenue more than triples on its own. The sales team's entire contribution becomes additive. That is the compounding engine, and it is the reason infrastructure companies are valued the way they are valued. Nothing else in the model explains a premium of that size. It is not the technology, and it is not the customer list. It is the fact that last year's work keeps producing this year's revenue. 2 operating instructions follow from all of this, and both are immediately applicable. First, measure expansion on committed accounts only, not blended. Exclude the anchor customer and exclude any at-will whales, meaning large customers who can walk out on short notice and whose spending therefore tells you nothing durable about the product. That number, expansion on committed accounts, is the one that predicts the multiple. Blended revenue growth does not, because blended growth can be inflated indefinitely by winning new logos. And here is the practical argument for producing it yourself. A Series B lead investor will construct that number during diligence whether or not the company presents it. They will take your customer list, they will strip out the anchor, and they will compute it. The only question you get to decide is whether it is computed with your framing and your explanation attached, or in a spreadsheet you never see. Second, and this one is counterintuitive enough that it is worth stating bluntly, cut prices deliberately as you scale. Twilio's expansion rates, that entire series I just read out, were achieved net of repeated price reductions. Twilio kept cutting what it charged per message and per minute, and its customers still spent more every year because lower unit prices unlocked use cases that were simply not viable at the old price. In a land grab phase, volume elasticity beats margin defense. For HeyMax, the translation is uncomfortable, but I think it is unambiguous. The roughly 1.4 cents per mile it charges its business buyers today is an opening price. It is not a floor. The plan should explicitly anticipate charging less per mile over time while making more gross profit in total. And it should say so in advance, in writing, so that when the price does come down, it reads as strategy rather than as weakness. That transition, charging less per unit and earning more in total, sounds like a contradiction right up until you have watched it happen at scale. Which is precisely what the next chapter is about, and the company that did it left the entire arithmetic sitting in its public filings for anyone who cares to check. Chapter 5, Marqeta's Lesson, Revenue is a Vanity Metric. This is the most important case study in the set for 2 reasons. It is the one that inverts the obvious reading of a set of financials, and HeyMax's business-to-business book has exactly the concentration profile that makes it relevant. Marqeta went public in 2021 as a card-issuing platform, which means it runs the technology that lets another company launch and operate its own payment cards. It went public with a famous problem. Square was 70% of its net revenue in 2020 and 73% in the first quarter of 2021. Note the direction of travel. The concentration was not easing as the company scaled. It was still rising at the moment of the initial public offering. And it was worse than the headline percentage suggested. Of the $147 million of net revenue Marqeta added in 2020, $117.7 million came from Square. 80% of all growth from a single customer. Strip out that one relationship and the growth story very nearly disappears. Then the thing that every concentrated platform quietly fears actually happened. In August, and again in November of 2023, the anchor renegotiated. Here is the result, and I want to go through it slowly, because the numbers point in opposite directions, and that contradiction is the entire lesson. Net revenue fell 32%, from $748 million in 2022 to $507 million in 2024. The blended take rate, meaning the share of all the money flowing through the platform that Marqeta actually keeps, collapsed from 0.661% in 2019 to 0.163% in 2025. That is roughly a 75% compression in what the company earns per dollar passing through it. And gross profit rose every single year, from $320 million to $437 million. Gross margin went from 43% to 70%. Marqeta booked its first full-year profit under generally accepted accounting principles in the very year its revenue fell hardest. Meanwhile, the underlying business was not shrinking at all. Processing volume grew from $21.7 billion to $382.5 billion, and the concentration problem solved itself along the way. Square went from 71% of net revenue in 2022 to 45% in 2025. So here is a company whose revenue fell by roughly a third, and which over the same stretch grew its processing volume enormously, raised its gross profit every single year, nearly doubled its gross margin, reached profitability for the first time, and diversified its customer base. If you had read only the revenue line, you would have concluded it was dying. 3 lessons transfer directly. 1. In a pass-through business, revenue is a vanity metric. Track gross profit per unit of volume instead. The reason is mechanical. If your reported revenue includes money you immediately hand to somebody else, a card network, an airline, a bank, then that revenue was never really yours. It was always going to be repriced eventually. And when it is repriced, the event looks like a catastrophe in the revenue line and a triumph in the profit line. The same event at the same moment. The only question that matters is which line your board has been trained to look at first. 2. Concentration is survivable, but only on one condition: that you are building the second 100 customers while the first one is paying the bills. Marqeta survived 70% concentration because its other customers were growing underneath the anchor, and because its cost to serve fell as it scaled. Neither of those things is automatic. Both were the product of deliberate investment made during exactly the years when the anchor's checks made that investment feel unnecessary. 3, and this is the caveat that matters most for HeyMax, so I want to be careful not to let a good story run away with the analogy. The Marqeta escape does not straightforwardly work here. Marqeta's margins expanded because its cost to serve is software. Software amortizes across volume. The 10 millionth transaction costs essentially nothing more than the 9 millionth, so when you cut your price and volume rises to meet it, your margin can rise along with the volume. HeyMax's cost to serve is not software. It is the cost of a mile. That cost is set by airline partners, and it is rising. The prior study in this series established the arithmetic precisely. The marginal redemption cost is floored at 1.8 cents by HeyMax's own product design, and partner costs have run as high as 3.5 cents. Those are hard floors set by counterparties. They are not soft costs that quietly scale away as you get bigger. So a points platform cannot assume the software margin curve. It cannot simply cut its price, grow the volume, and wait for the margin to show up, because the largest single component of its cost does not amortize at all. It has to earn its margin from direct partner contracts instead, which is to say by buying redemption supply better than it does today. Which produces a conclusion that is easy to miss and important to state plainly. Redemption supply negotiation is not a consumer product problem. It is an infrastructure strategy problem. The price you can offer a bank for miles as a service is set, in the end, by what you pay the airline. Everything in the platform layer sits on top of that single input, and no amount of engineering discipline anywhere else in the stack substitutes for getting it right. Chapter 6, Plaid's Lesson, The Strategic Premium. The last of the playbooks is not about how to build infrastructure. It is about what infrastructure is worth to somebody who is afraid of it. And the evidence here is unusually candid, for a reason that has nothing to do with corporate generosity. It was produced in litigation. When a deal goes to court, the internal documents come out, and executives who wrote frankly to each other discover, some months later, that they were writing for the public. In January of 2020, Visa agreed to buy Plaid for $5.3 billion. The Department of Justice sued to block the acquisition, and the complaint it filed quotes Visa's own internal papers at length. Start with the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is the whole point. Plaid had, in the complaint's phrasing, almost $100 million of revenue in 2019. Against that, $5.3 billion is what the government called an unprecedented revenue multiple of over 50 times. 50 times revenue is not a number anybody reaches by building a spreadsheet, and Visa's own chief executive said as much in writing. He wrote that the deal does not hunt on financial grounds. It was, in his phrase, strategic, not financial. So what was the strategy? Visa's head of strategic opportunities drew Plaid as a volcano. The visible business, the part that anybody could price, was the tip showing above the water. What lies beneath, though, he wrote, is a massive opportunity, one that threatens Visa. The same executive compressed the fear into a single sentence that anyone who has lived through a platform shift will recognize immediately. I don't want to be IBM to their Microsoft. The chief executive was blunter still about what he thought he was buying. He described the acquisition as an insurance policy to protect our debit business in the United States, and there was a number attached to that policy. Visa's board had been shown an estimate of $300 to $500 million of downside risk to United States debit by the year 2024. Now hold up the economics being defended from the same complaint, because this is where the volcano becomes visible. Take a $60 online debit transaction. Routing it over Visa's rails costs about 39 cents. Routing it over the bank transfer alternative, the kind of payment that Plaid's data connections make possible, costs about 2 cents. That is a 95% saving. And set that against Visa's own internal estimate of an 88% operating margin on debit network fees, and the picture assembles itself. An extraordinarily profitable toll road was looking at a competing route that charged almost nothing, and the company that held the keys to that route was available for sale. 3 things to take from this, and I want to be careful with all 3, because this is the case study most easily misread as good news. The first is the lesson itself. Infrastructure gets paid a strategic premium precisely when it threatens an incumbent's rails. 50 times revenue is not a financial valuation. It is a defensive one. Nobody at Visa believed Plaid's earnings justified that price, and the complaint shows they said so internally. They were not buying earnings. They were buying the removal of a threat, and the price of removing a threat is set by the size of the threat, not by the size of the target. The prior studies in this series established that HeyMax's most plausible outcome is an acquisition somewhere in the range of $150 to $400 million. The Plaid case is the argument for the top of that range and above. But it is a conditional argument, and the condition is severe. The premium is available only to a company that is genuinely load-bearing on somebody else's flow. A company that is merely useful, merely well-liked, merely growing, gets valued on its financials like everybody else. The second thing to take from this is the part people forget when they tell the story. The deal was blocked. Strategic premiums attract antitrust attention exactly because they are strategic, and the reasoning that justifies the price is the same reasoning that makes it look like a company buying out a competitor. Visa walked away in January of 2021. Being the volcano is not the same thing as being able to sell the volcano. The valuation was real. The transaction was not. And the third thing is the test, which is the most useful artifact in the entire complaint because it tells you whether you qualify. Visa paid because Plaid sat in the path of transactions that Visa needed. That is the whole of it. Not because Plaid was innovative, not because Plaid had good logos, not because Plaid was growing fast, because Plaid was in the way. The playbook chapter states the test plainly, and it is worth memorizing. If your customer can switch you off without changing their product, you are not their infrastructure. Read that slowly against a real customer list because it is unforgiving. It does not ask whether the customer is happy. It does not ask whether the integration took 6 weeks and a lot of engineering. It asks one narrow question. If your service disappeared tomorrow, would something in the customer's product visibly break, or would a feature simply stop appearing? By that test, capped promotional campaigns are not infrastructure relationships, however impressive the logo attached to them. A campaign has a fixed pool. When the pool empties, the campaign ends and nothing in the counterparty's product breaks. The counterparty goes back to the product they had before. That is not a rail. That is a marketing budget with an integration attached to it. This is the test that Chapter 12 applies, name by name, to HeyMax's own published customer list. I will not preview the result here beyond saying that the exercise is uncomfortable in a useful way. But the framing belongs at the end of the playbook section because it is the bridge between the case studies and the mirror. Everything in Stripe, Twilio, Marqeta, and Plaid points at the same underlying claim. The value of an infrastructure business is not what it earns. It is the cost to the world of removing it. And that cost is not something a company can assert about itself. It is something a customer demonstrates, transaction by transaction, by being unable to function without you. Chapter 7, The Buyers. If the first half of this study was about the standard, this half is about the market. And the market for loyalty infrastructure is not one market. It is 6, each with a different purchase, a different buying cycle, and a different reason to say no. Getting these 6 apart matters more than it might sound, because the most common failure in enterprise selling is pitching the right product to a buyer whose objection you have not identified. Start at the top. Tier 1 banks buy a complete rewards proposition with transfer partners already attached. They are not buying a component. They are buying an outcome, and they buy it through procurement. That means 12 to 24 month cycles. It means vendor risk assessment. It means security questionnaires that arrive as spreadsheets and come back as spreadsheets. And it means exit planning, written into the contract before the first mile is ever issued. This is Ascenda's home turf, and it is defended by a decade of references. HSBC, Citi, Barclays, Standard Chartered, Capital One, and, as of April of 2026, DBS in Hong Kong. The honest assessment from the previous study in this series stands, and I am going to repeat it without softening. In a Tier 1 bank request for proposal today, Ascenda wins. That is not a judgment about product quality. It is a statement about references, artifacts, and procurement history, none of which a challenger can manufacture at speed. The winnable fight is everywhere else, and the rest of this chapter is about where else. The second segment is neobanks and fintechs. And this is simultaneously the best segment for a challenger and the most volatile one in the market. The evidence for both halves of that sentence sits in 3 examples. The first is Bunk. Its loyalty program, Bunk Points, is publicly powered by Ascenda across 5 European markets, and it launched as Bunk was killing off its cashback product. So here is a neobank that decided points beat cashback and bought the capability rather than building it. The second is Revolut. RevPoints runs more than 30 airline partners at a 1-to-1 transfer ratio, with no vendor publicly credited anywhere. Which means the largest neobank in the category looked at the same decision and built it in-house. And the third is Robinhood. The Gold Card pays a flat 3% cash back with no points currency at all, so that is a third answer. Not buy, not build, but decline the whole premise. Buy, build, or abandon. Those are the 3 outcomes in this segment, and which one a given fintech chooses is the single best predictor of whether a deal there is winnable. It is worth far more as a qualifying question than anything about budget or timeline, because a company that has already built has nothing to buy, and a company that has abandoned points has nothing to buy either. The third segment is merchants and retailers, and what they buy is not a loyalty currency at all. They buy promotions and offers engines. Rules, triggers, discounts, campaign logic. That is Talon 1's category, and it is the category that Adyen just paid €750 million to own. Notice what that tells you. The money in the merchant segment is flowing to the engine that sits closest to the transaction. The fourth segment is employers and human resources platforms, and they buy perks. This is the segment that HeyMax already serves through miles as an employee benefit, and structurally, it is the easiest of the six to sell into, for one reason that has nothing to do with the product. There is no regulator in the room. No vendor risk questionnaire, no exit plan, no compliance calendar. A benefits manager can simply decide. The fifth segment is travel platforms, and what they buy is redemption inventory. They already have the customer and the moment of intent. What they lack is something to give away. And the sixth segment is telcos and super apps, which buy scale partnerships. Here there is a recent example worth pausing over, because it is the one that reframes the chapter. In October of 2025, 8 Asian telcos, serving a combined customer base of more than 350 million people, launched a joint loyalty venture. And in announcing it, they named no technology vendor at all. That absence deserves its own sentence, because it is the shape of this market's future rather than a curiosity of one press release. In Asia-Pacific, the 2 largest pools of loyalty members are now being served by a card network and by a telco consortium, and neither of them is buying loyalty software. Think about what that means for a vendor. The biggest concentrations of members in the region are being assembled by organizations that already own the distribution, already own the customer relationship, and either build the capability themselves or absorb it through partnership rather than procurement. They are not shopping in the $13 billion software pool at all. The money is moving to whoever sits in the flow, not to whoever sells the tooling for the flow. Which loops directly back to the ratio from the opening chapter, the roughly $8 of rewards value moving for every dollar of rewards software sold. The buyers with the largest member pools have worked out the same thing the ratio implies, and they have arranged themselves on the correct side of it. So the practical reading of this chapter for a challenger is a triage, and I would run it in this order. Tier 1 banks are the prize, and they are, today, not winnable on artifacts. Neobanks and fintechs are winnable, but must be qualified hard on whether they intend to buy at all. Merchants and retailers are winnable through the offers engines rather than directly, which is a partnership motion and not a sales motion. Employers are the softest ground available and should be treated as such because they convert without a compliance calendar attached. Travel platforms want inventory, which is the one thing a redemption business genuinely has. And telcos and super apps are, on current evidence, not buying vendors at all. 6 segments, 6 different objections, and only one of them, the employer segment, that a company can win today without first building the trust surface that the next chapters are about. Chapter 8, the regulator sets the service level. Here is the fact that reorders a Singapore infrastructure roadmap, and what makes it strange is that it is not a commercial fact at all. When you sell to a Singapore financial institution, the service level is not negotiated with the buyer. It is set by the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Read that again, because it inverts the ordinary logic of enterprise selling. Normally, availability is a bargaining chip. The vendor proposes a number, the buyer pushes for a better one, and somewhere in the middle there is a service credit schedule that both sides can live with. In this market, that conversation does not happen because the buyer has no authority to have it. The number arrives from outside the room, and the bank's job is simply to confirm that the vendor clears it. The specifics are these. For critical systems, total unscheduled downtime must not exceed 4 hours in any 12-month period. For incidents, the institution must notify the regulator within 1 hour of discovery and follow with a root cause and impact analysis within 14 days. Those 2 obligations sit on the bank, not on the vendor. But they cannot stay there because the bank cannot outsource its own accountability to the supervisor, so they are pushed down the contract. A vendor service level agreement weaker than the regulatory standard cannot be signed, no matter how much the business unit wants the product, because signing it would leave the bank holding an obligation it has no operational ability to meet. One caveat before I build anything on top of this, and it is the kind of caveat that should travel with the number. Those figures come from law firm and consultant summaries of the guidance rather than from the primary notices, which were unreachable during this research. Treat them as reliable for planning and verify them before quoting them in an actual contract negotiation. Now convert the 4 hours into the language a vendor actually publishes. 4 hours of unscheduled downtime in a year is 99.95% availability. The standard startup service level agreement, the one that appears on almost every platform pricing page as a matter of habit, is 99.9%. That allows roughly 8.8 hours of downtime in a year, which is more than double the regulatory ceiling. So here is the uncomfortable conclusion, and it is worth stating precisely, because it is the kind of thing a company does by accident and then discovers 18 months later in a procurement review. A company that publishes a 3/9 service level agreement has published a number that disqualifies it from the buyer segment it says it is targeting. Not a number that weakens its position, a number that removes it from consideration. The published commitment is itself the disqualification, and it was published for free by a team copying an industry default. And the ground underneath all of this is moving. In March of 2026, the Monetary Authority of Singapore proposed new third-party risk management guidelines. The critical change is one of scope. The old framework governed outsourcing. The new proposal widens it to any third-party arrangement, and it names the categories explicitly: software as a service platforms, data vendors, fintech partnerships, cloud. On top of that widened scope, the proposal adds concentration risk assessment, group-level oversight, and mandatory exit planning, with a proposed 6-month transition period. 2 consequences follow, and they pull in different directions. The first is a straightforward raising of the bar. A rewards vendor that was previously out of scope because it was not an outsourcing arrangement in the old technical sense is now in scope by default. Everything that used to apply only to core banking suppliers applies to the loyalty platform too. The compliance cost of entering this market just went up for every challenger, and it went up most for the ones that had been quietly relying on being small enough not to matter. The second consequence is more interesting, and it undermines a piece of strategy that most infrastructure companies treat as settled. Mandatory exit planning is a regulator legislating against integration lock-in. Think about what exit planning actually requires. Before the contract begins, the bank must document how it would leave, what the data extraction looks like, who the alternative vendors are, how long a migration would take. In other words, the supervisor is requiring that every customer maintain, in writing, a current plan for replacing you. The standard infrastructure moat, the one every platform company describes to its investors, is switching cost. You are embedded, migration is painful, therefore renewal is safe. That moat is being deliberately weakened here, not by a competitor, but by the supervisor as a matter of financial stability policy. And a moat that the regulator is actively dismantling is not a moat you should be pricing into a plan. Which means stickiness has to come from somewhere else entirely. It has to come from economics and from demand, from being cheaper to keep than to replace, and from bringing something the customer cannot obtain by switching, not from being painful to leave. Set all of this against the calendar, and the shape of the constraint becomes clear. The compliance calendar is the binding constraint on the entire business-to-business plan, not the engineering roadmap, which is weeks of work by people already employed, not the pricing decision, which is a meeting. The compliance calendar, because it contains the one item in this whole study that cannot be accelerated by effort or by money. An audit observation window runs on wall clock time. You cannot pay to make 3 months pass in one. and a regulatory floor of 99.95% availability is not something you can promise on the day the contract is drafted. It is something you have to be able to demonstrate you have been delivering. So the regulator sets the service level. The regulator has just widened the scope of who has to meet it, and the regulator has begun legislating against the moat that would otherwise protect the vendor who does. Chapter 13 returns to this with dates attached, and the dates are where the discomfort really lives. Chapter 9, what the competition charges. 3 pricing facts and 1 cautionary tale complete the picture of this market. The pricing facts tell you what a buyer will compare you against. The cautionary tale tells you what happens when you believe your position is safer than it is. The first fact, Ascended deleted the setup fee. From October of 2024, the company's public position has been that it works always without setup costs or platform fees, charging only for content and growth outcomes actually delivered. It is tempting to read that as a discount, and it is not. It is a procurement weapon, and it is worth understanding exactly why. A setup fee and a platform fee are capital expenditure. They are a commitment made before any value has been delivered, which means they attract a different kind of scrutiny inside a bank. They require a business case, a budget line, and usually a more senior approval than an operating cost does. Removing them moves the entire purchase from capital expenditure into operating expenditure, and that single reclassification shortens the approval chain by whole layers of the organization. So the consequence for anybody entering this market is direct and unpleasant. A challenger arriving with a platform fee is not merely more expensive than the incumbent. It is arriving with a longer sales cycle than the incumbent, against a competitor whose commercial model has already been optimized for how banks actually approve spending. The second fact, the exchange layer earns 14%. That is the disclosed gross margin of Points International on roughly $370 million of revenue in its last year as a public company. And it is worth holding on to because it is the only audited number of its kind anywhere in this industry. Pure points transfer infrastructure is a low-margin business. It's sold for about 1x revenue, which means that if the ambition is simply to move points between programs, the market has already told you what that is worth, with an audit opinion attached. The third fact I have stated before, and I am restating deliberately, because in Chapter 3 it read as a cultural observation, and here it is a competitive one. Enterprise loyalty has no public price anchor. Every enterprise vendor in this category publishes a pricing model and no numbers, data volume, customer activity, monthly active members, nowhere a dollar figure. And the practical effect of that unanimity is that a buyer cannot evaluate anybody in this market without first booking a meeting. Which is also the opening. The first vendor to publish a credible entry price in this category will be the only vendor a buyer can assess without picking up the phone. In a market where every competitor requires a conversation before it will reveal anything, publishing a number is not a concession. It is the only available way to be the vendor a buyer can shortlist on a Tuesday afternoon. Now the cautionary tale, which is the best documented switching case in loyalty, and which demolishes an assumption that almost every infrastructure company holds about itself. On the 2nd of June, 2025, Eagle Eye announced that a United States grocery contract would end. The contract was worth $9 to $10 million a year, and the company described it in its own announcement as high margin in nature. It would end on the 2nd of August, 2 months' notice. Pause on the reason, because the reason is the entire lesson. The contract did not end because of a service failure. It did not end because a competitor undercut the price. It ended because the counterparty had acquired a competitor that already owned the capability, and having acquired it, insourced the work. Nothing Eagle Eye did cause this. Nothing Eagle Eye could have done would have prevented it. The market's response was immediate. Eagle Eye's shares fell 36 to 40%, and group recurring revenue fell 14%. The lesson is the one that every infrastructure company tells itself is not true of its own relationships. Integration depth bought nothing. This was a deeply embedded, high-margin, multi-year relationship with a large enterprise buyer, and it ended on 60 days' notice for a reason entirely outside the vendor's control. Every comforting sentence a vendor says about switching costs was true here. The integration was real. The workflows were built around it. The customer left anyway, because a corporate development decision 2 levels above the relationship made leaving the obvious thing to do. Now combine that with the finding from the previous chapter that the Monetary Authority of Singapore is proposing to mandate exit planning as a condition of the arrangement, and the conclusion for strategy becomes uncomfortable but very clear. In this market, lock-in is not a defensible moat. It fails from above when a supervisor requires every customer to maintain a live plan for replacing you. And it fails from the side when a customer acquires the capability by acquiring somebody else, and your integration depth becomes an inconvenience to be scheduled rather than a barrier to be respected. What replaces it is a different sentence, and I would put this one on the wall. Being cheaper to keep than to replace is the moat. Not harder to remove, cheaper to keep. Those are different properties, and on the evidence of this chapter, only the second one survives a regulator writing an exit plan into the contract or a customer acquiring the capability outright. Which points at the thing the previous studies in this series already identified, and this chapter simply confirms from the competitive direction. The defensible position is proprietary redemption supply and first-party consumer demand. Direct contracts with airlines and hotels that a competitor cannot replicate by writing software. And an audience that arrives with the product, that the customer gains access to by working with you and loses by leaving. Neither of those is something a customer can insource by buying a competitor. That is the test. Not whether it is painful to leave, but whether leaving costs the customer something that no acquisition can hand back to them. Everything else in this market, the integrations, the campaign tooling, the platform fees, the switching friction, is negotiable, replaceable, or about to be legislated against. Chapter 10, the live audit. Everything to this point has been the standard. This chapter is the measurement. It was conducted on the 4th of August, 2026, against HeyMax's public surface, and it is the factual core of this study. Before any of the results, I have to describe a trap, because falling into it would have produced a completely false picture, and I suspect other people have already fallen into it. Every hostname under HeyMax's domain returns a success code. Every one, including a control hostname that I invented for this audit, and that has never existed at any point in the company's history. They all resolve to the same address, and they all return a byte-identical consumer app shell, not a similar page, the same page to the byte. So the host names a technical buyer would try first, the ones that are effectively a convention across the industry, docs, developers, developer, API, and status, do not exist as developer properties. There is nothing behind any of them. There is only the consumer app served under a different name. But here is why this matters beyond a curiosity. Any audit that checks status codes rather than content would report 5 developer properties that are not there, an investor's analyst running a quick check, a bank's vendor risk questionnaire asking whether documentation and a status page exist, an automated procurement scan. All of them would come back with a clean result for 5 properties that contain nothing. Only the business subdomain, honestly, returns a not found error. The sitemap settles the question beyond argument. It contains 5,202 web addresses. Of those, the complete set of non-consumer routes is 9. 9 out of 5,202. And the specific paths a technical buyer would look for are not among them: documentation, an interface reference, a developer portal, pricing, security, trust, legal terms for business customers. Every one of those returns a not found error. The robots file allows everything, which closes off the one charitable explanation available. Nothing is being deliberately hidden from crawlers or held back for authenticated users. The absence is real rather than concealed. Now the scores. On the developer experience bar, the 12 artifacts described earlier in this study, HeyMax scores 0 out of 12. 9 of those artifacts are simply absent. The remaining 3 are unknowable because there is no public interface to inspect, and you cannot assess versioning discipline or idempotency handling on an interface that has no public existence. On the trust surface, the 9 artifacts are regulated buyer checks. HeyMax scores 0 out of 9. No status page, no security page, no compliance attestation, no subprocessor list, no data processing agreement, no published service level agreement. 0 out of 12 and 0 out of 9. The business page itself is live, and I want to be fair about what it does contain. It confirms the 4 business propositions from the strategy documents, verbatim. The positioning that the whole strategy rests on is publicly stated, and it is stated accurately. But 3 details from the rendered page tell a story about how much attention this surface currently receives, and they are worth listing individually, because each one lands differently on a different kind of buyer. First, SingSaver is the single-named reference logo on the page. 1. Second, every call to action on the page is the same 3 words, talk to us. There is no self-serve path anywhere. There is no documentation link, no sandbox, no price. The only available action is to request a meeting. And third, the freshness signals. The page's own latest news module is dated May to July of 2024. The affiliate subpage still claims a customer count that matches the monthly active figure from the first quarter of 2025, and the copyright line at the bottom of the page reads 2024. I want to be precise about what all of this does and does not mean, because it would be very easy to overread. None of this is a judgment about the underlying product, which may be excellent. I have not evaluated the product. This audit did not test whether miles issue correctly, whether redemptions complete, whether the platform is reliable, or whether customers are happy. It could be, on every one of those dimensions, a very good piece of engineering. What this is, and all it is a measurement of what a buyer can verify without asking. And that distinction only sounds like a hedge until you consider what kind of business this is. For an infrastructure business, the public surface is the product until a meeting happens. That is not a metaphor. It is the operating reality of how technical buyers evaluate vendors. A developer forms a judgment from the documentation before speaking to anybody. A vendor risk analyst forms a judgment from the trust center before the security questionnaire is even sent. By the time a conversation occurs, both of those judgments have already been made, and the conversation is spent either confirming them or fighting them. Which produces the sentence that this chapter exists to deliver, and it is the sentence I would put in front of the board. A company whose strategy is to become the region's loyalty infrastructure currently has no public evidence that it is a platform at all. Not weak evidence, not evidence that needs improving, no evidence. 0 on both bars from an audit that is dated and reproducible, and that anyone, including a competitor, including a prospective buyer, including a Series B investor's diligence team, can run for themselves in an afternoon. And I would add one thing about the trap I opened with, because I think it is the most consequential finding in the chapter, and it cuts in an unexpected direction. The fact that every hostname returns a success code means the company's public surface currently reports better than it is. An automated check comes back clean. A superficial diligence pass finds 5 developer properties, which means the gap between what HeyMax appears to have and what HeyMax actually has is invisible to exactly the kind of quick, automated look that happens early in a process and becomes visible only later, when somebody serious opens the page and finds a consumer app. That is the worst possible sequencing. It means the discovery happens after expectations have been set, in front of the buyer you least want to surprise. Everything else in this study is analysis. This chapter is measurement, and the measurement says the execution surface is empty. Chapter 11, the supplier publishes more than the customer. The comparison that makes the audit land is not the comparison you would expect. It is not Stripe. Stripe is an easy company to lose to. It has been publishing its developer surface since 2011. It has shipped almost 100 backwards incompatible upgrades without breaking a single existing integration. Nobody seriously expects a 30-person company in Singapore to match that. If Stripe were the only benchmark, scoring 0 out of 12 on the developer experience bar and 0 out of 9 on the trust surface would be awkward, but it would also be forgivable. The comparison that actually matters is much closer to home, and it is far less comfortable. It is Ascenda. Ascenda is uncomfortable precisely because it occupies two positions at the same time. It is HeyMax's most direct competitor in enterprise loyalty, the incumbent that wins Tier 1 bank deals on a decade of references. And it is also HeyMax's supplier. The transfer rails that HeyMax's own redemptions run across belong to Ascenda. So let me put the two public surfaces side by side, and let me be specific, because the specifics are the whole argument. Ascenda publishes 143 documented pages. Roughly 70 of those are guides, and 73 are API endpoint references. Inside that documentation, you find the artifacts that the platform playbook says separate a company that has an API from a company that is infrastructure. Idempotency handling on mutating calls so that a retried request does not issue the same miles twice. Explicit versioning so a buyer knows what happens when the vendor changes something. Signed webhooks so the receiving system can verify that a message really came from the sender. Those are not documentation niceties. They are the engineering commitments that allow a regulated institution to build a product on top of somebody else's service. Ascenda also runs a public status page with component-level uptime. And Ascenda maintains a trust center. Inside it sits SOC2 Type 2 certification and ISO 27001 certification, 14 published policies, 11 named subprocessors, which is exactly the list a bank's vendor risk team asks for on the first call, and 66 pre-answered security questionnaire items. That last number deserves a moment of its own. 66 pre-answered questions means Ascenda has already sat down and cleared, in advance and in public, the precise procurement friction that a bank imposes on every new vendor. A questionnaire that would consume 3 weeks of a startup's engineering time has already been completed once for everyone who will ever ask. And then comes the detail that turns a comparison into an argument. One of the components Ascenda monitors on that public status page is its transfer API that is the rail HeyMax's own points transfers run through. Let me say that again slowly, because it is the sentence this chapter exists to deliver. Ascenda publishes uptime for the API that HeyMax depends on. HeyMax publishes nothing at all to the customers who depend on HeyMax. The supplier is more transparent about the shared dependency than the customer is about its own service. If a bank's vendor risk analyst wanted to know whether HeyMax's redemption path had been healthy last month, the only public place to look would be the supplier's website. Two strategic consequences follow from this, and they run in opposite directions. I want to give both of them fairly. The first is a warning. In any competitive evaluation where the buyer does its own homework, and vendor risk teams always do their own homework, that is the entire job, the comparison is not close. And here is the part that stings. It is not about product quality. Nothing in this audit measures whether HeyMax's product is better or worse than Ascenda's. It measures something else entirely. It measures whether the vendor has done the work that makes it possible to buy them. The previous study in this series concluded that Ascenda is beatable. Not in a Tier 1 bank request for proposal, where a decade of references decides the outcome, but in the mid-market, on speed, on package demand, and on coalition mechanics. I still believe that, but that advantage is only realizable if a mid-market buyer can actually complete a purchase. And today, The artifacts that would let a buyer finish an evaluation without booking a sales call do not exist. Speed is worth nothing if the fast path is closed. The second consequence is an opportunity, and it is larger than it looks. Ascenda has been repositioning in public. It now sells merchants access to bank audiences. Read as a competitor should read it, that repositioning is an admission. It says that demand generation is what this market actually wants to buy, and Ascenda owns no consumers of its own. It has bank distribution, and it is renting audience access from the very customers it serves. HeyMax already has the consumer demand, and HeyMax has something else, something genuinely unclaimed. The previous studies in this series identified voluntary disclosure of redemption statistics as a credibility asset that nobody in this category has taken. In an industry where unredeemed points are quietly assumed and never discussed, the first company to publish real redemption data owns a piece of ground that no competitor can take back by shipping a feature. And here is the insight that ties the chapter together. The trust surface and the data disclosure are the same project. They are not two initiatives competing for the same engineering week. They are one motion. A status page, a security page carrying practices and a subprocessor list, a visible SOC2 roadmap, and a published quarterly redemption statistic. Put those four things together, and you have the cheapest available answer to the hardest question a bank will ever ask, which is why should we trust a 30-person company with our customers' rewards? Every one of those four items is weeks of work, not quarters, not a funding round, weeks by people already on the payroll. The framing is worth sitting with because it is this chapter in a single line. A company whose stated strategy is to become the region's loyalty infrastructure is currently less legible to a buyer than the supplier it intends to replace. That is not a product problem. It is a publishing problem. And publishing problems are the only kind of problem in this entire study that can be solved by deciding to solve them. Chapter 12, Reading the Customer List Honestly. Every business-to-business pitch deck has a logo wall. It is the oldest device in enterprise selling, and it works because a logo is a shortcut for judgment somebody else has already exercised. This chapter takes HeyMax's logo wall and runs the platform playbook's own tests across it, one at a time. The exercise is uncomfortable, and I think it is uncomfortable in a useful way. Before I begin, one thing has to be said plainly, and I want it heard clearly. Everything in this chapter is analysis applied to documented facts that are already public. It is not a claim that anyone has misrepresented anything. The relationships on that list are real relationships. What I am doing is applying one specific lens, the lens an infrastructure investor or an acquirer would apply, and reporting what that lens shows. A logo wall is not a lie. It is simply a different instrument from the one you need to run a platform business. Test 1. Which direction does the money flow? The rule is short enough to state in 6 words. A customer pays you. A supplier is paid by you. Run the published list through that rule. Visa and Ascenda are suppliers. Visa provides the card linking rails. Ascenda provides the transfer rails that HeyMax's redemptions run on, the same rails from the last chapter, the ones whose uptime Ascenda publishes and HeyMax does not. Neither of those is a customer buying miles as a service. They are inputs. 2 further names are affiliate relationships. In an affiliate relationship, HeyMax earns a commission for sending traffic to a partner. That is money flowing toward HeyMax for a service rendered, which is genuine revenue, but it is not a platform customer buying miles as a service. It is media, not infrastructure. Strip out everyone HeyMax pays, and everyone who pays HeyMax in a capacity that is not the platform, and roughly 9 paying platform relationships remain. 2 of those 9 arrived with an acquisition rather than through the sales motion. Test 2. Is your API load bearing on their product? The playbook's formulation of this test is blunt, and it comes out of the Plaid litigation. If they can switch you off without changing their product, they are not an anchor. Visa paid $5.3 billion for Plaid because Plaid sat directly in the path of transactions Visa needed. That is what load-bearing means. Now apply it to the marquee wins. The Octopus integration in Hong Kong was a campaign with 1 million reward slots and a per-member cap of 1,000 miles. The Visa Hong Kong activation was a fixed 1 million-mile pool. Both of those are genuinely impressive distribution moments. I do not want to minimize them. Getting a card network and a transit and payments network in Hong Kong to put your currency in front of their members is hard, and doing it from Singapore with a small team is harder. But structurally, both are capped promotional campaigns rather than contracts. They end when the pool empties, and when they end, nothing in the counterparty's product breaks. Octopus still works. The Visa card still works. Nobody has to ship an engineering change to remove HeyMax because HeyMax was never inside the product in the first place. This produces the finding that should most concern anyone modeling this business as infrastructure. If the business-to-business book is materially composed of capped campaigns, then net revenue retention could plausibly sit below 100%. The reason is mechanical rather than commercial. A campaign that concludes does not renew. It simply stops. There is no renegotiation, no expansion, no upsell, because there was never a subscription to expand. Hold that against the equity story of the company that defined this category. Twilio's entire investment case rested on expansion rates that ran somewhere between 103% and 170%, sustained across more than a decade of filings. That band is what earns an infrastructure valuation multiple. An infrastructure business with expansion below 100% is not an infrastructure business. It is a project business with an API attached. Those two things look identical on a logo wall, and they are worth entirely different multiples. And here is the uncomfortable part. HeyMax does not currently disclose the metric, which means neither management nor a prospective investor can distinguish the two cases from the outside, and I suspect nobody can distinguish them from the inside either. Test 3. Is this sales or is this procurement? Of the 4 published business-to-business propositions, 2 are genuine sales. Loyalty as a service sold to brands is a sale. Miles sold as an employee benefit is a sale. Money comes in. The other 2 are not. The affiliate proposition is HeyMax buying acquisition inventory. The airline and hotel proposition is HeyMax buying redemption supply. Both of those activities are absolutely essential. Without redemption supply, there is no product at all, and the previous chapters in this study argued that direct supply contracts are where the margin has to come from. But essential is not the same as revenue. Those are purchases dressed in the same visual language as sales. Presenting 4 propositions, where 2 of them are purchases, makes the platform business look roughly twice the size it actually is. And the person most damaged by that is not the investor, who will eventually do the arithmetic. It is the team building the plan, who may believe they are further along than they are, and who may therefore underinvest in the part that is genuinely thin. Now let me be fair, because fairness here is not a courtesy, it is accuracy. None of this diminishes what has been built. 9 paying platform relationships and a live coalition bridge assembled in under 3 years by a company of 30 people is genuinely fast. Most companies with that headcount and that vintage have 3 logos and a pilot. The Octopus and Visa activations are real distribution achievements that most competitors could not have landed at all. I would not want a listener to come away from this chapter thinking the business-to-business effort has failed, because that is not what the evidence says. The point is much narrower than that, and it is about instrumentation rather than performance. The company cannot currently tell from its own reporting whether its business-to-business book is compounding or churning. Those 2 futures diverge enormously. One of them is worth an infrastructure multiple. The other is worth a services multiple, and the gap between those 2 numbers is most of the company's eventual value. And that single distinction, compounding or churning, is the one thing an infrastructure valuation actually depends on. It is measurable today, from contracts already signed and sitting in the building. It just is not being measured. Chapter 13, the sequence. Here is the build order. And I want to state the constraint that governs the whole thing before I list a single task, because if you get the constraint wrong, the order of everything else stops mattering. The calendar is the binding constraint, and the calendar is already broken. Here is why. SOC2 Type 2 requires an observation window of 3 to 12 months. That window cannot be compressed. It is not a question of money. The auditor fees run somewhere between $15,000 and $60,000, and all-in first-year costs land between $30,000 and $150,000, which is trivial against a single bank contract. You cannot pay to make time pass faster. Realistically, budget 9 to 12 months from the decision to the report being in hand. Now set that against the plan. The dossier opens a Series B in the second quarter of 2027, and it targets Tier 1 Lighthouse accounts to support that raise. A compliance program that starts in the first quarter of 2027 delivers a report in late 2027 or early 2028. That is after the raise, and it is after the point at which the buyers who require the report would have needed to complete onboarding. The dependency chain is brutally simple. No report, no bank onboarding, no bank logo, a weaker raise. Which makes starting the clock a decision for right now. And it is, by a wide margin, the cheapest item on this entire list. Phase 1, the foundation, weeks 1 through 6. Public API documentation with a real endpoint reference, not a marketing page describing that an API exists. A sandbox with self-serve test credentials that work without a sales call. Idempotency on every mutating call. Signed webhooks. A documented versioning and deprecation policy. Published rate limits and documented error codes with remediation. And a quick start that takes a developer from sign-up to a first successful call without ever speaking to a human being. Then instrument the 4 latencies the playbook identifies, because these are the actual funnel of a platform business and almost nobody measures them. Sign up to key to first call to production, and production to first paid transaction. If you cannot see those 4 numbers, you cannot tell whether your developer surface is working or merely present. Phase 2, the commercial surface. This runs in parallel with Phase 1, not after it. Publish a price for the first dollar, not the enterprise contract. Specifically, what it costs to issue the first 100,000 miles through the API, self-serve, with a card. Remember what this study found about the market. Every enterprise loyalty vendor publishes a pricing model, and not one of them publishes a number. Between roughly $2,400 a year and a 7-figure bank contract, there is no public price anchor anywhere in this industry. The first vendor to publish a credible entry price becomes the only one a buyer can evaluate without a meeting. Publish a free tier with an honest hard limit on it. And write down the volume at which self-serve ends and sales begins. Put it in writing. Then report the 2 populations separately in board reporting, from the very first month, exactly as Twilio did when it disclosed self-serve prepaid accounts graduating into committed 12-month contracts. Phase 3, the trust surface. This starts in week 1. The status page goes up this week. It is the cheapest procurement artifact in existence, roughly a week of work, and it is the first thing a vendor risk analyst looks for. A security page with practices and a subprocessor list follows within days. Start the SOC2 clock immediately. Take a type 1 at roughly week 8, so there is something sellable in hand while the real work proceeds, then run the observation window to completion. Publish a service level agreement, and publish one that clears the regulatory floor. This matters more in Singapore than almost anywhere else, because the service level here is not negotiated with the buyer at all. It is set by the Monetary Authority of Singapore. For critical systems, total unscheduled downtime must not exceed 4 hours in any 12-month period. That is 99.95% availability. The standard startup commitment of 99.9% allows roughly 8.8 hours, more than double the regulatory ceiling. So a company that publishes 3 nines has published a number that disqualifies it from the buyer segment it says it is targeting. Build a trust center, so the report converts from a compliance cost into a sales asset that a buyer can self-serve. And pursue ISO 27001 only when a named deal actually requires it, not before. Phase 4, the product tier decision, and this is where the research changes the plan. Of the 3 product tiers the strategy proposes, my recommendation is not to build the full loyalty stack. It is 70 guides worth of product that Ascenda already ships today. Competing there means competing on precisely the axis where a decade of bank references decides the outcome, and that is a fight you lose slowly and expensively. Sell the redemption layer instead. Sell it into the platforms that already own the merchant relationships, the offers and loyalty engines whose category Adyen just valued at 750 million euros when it bought Talon.1. Those platforms own distribution and lack travel redemption. HeyMax has travel redemption and lacks distribution. That is a trade, not a fight. And one sequencing correction that matters more than everything else in this phase. The redemption as a service product is gated on the first strategic pillar, not the second. Selling redemption on rails rented from Ascenda means routing your customer volume and your visible pipeline straight through a competitor. So direct airline contracts are not merely a margin project. They are the precondition for selling redemption as a product at all. Phase 5, the anchor and the instrumentation. Choose an anchor customer for whom the API is load-bearing on their core flow. Accept the concentration that comes with it, and plan the renegotiation from day one because it is coming. Marqeta's anchor renegotiated, and Marqeta survived it only because it had been building the second 100 customers while the first one paid the bills. Then publish the metrics an infrastructure business is judged on, none of which HeyMax currently discloses. Net revenue retention on committed accounts, gross profit per unit of volume rather than revenue, customer count, revenue concentration, API uptime, and time to integration. Marqeta is the frame here. Its revenue fell 32% while its gross profit rose every single year, and the corollary is unavoidable. A company that reports only revenue cannot see its own business. Chapter 14, the verdict. The diagnosis is right, and the execution surface is empty. That is the finding of this entire study in one line. The strategic plan survives every test I could apply to it. Business to business as the majority of revenue, price setting instead of price taking, coalitions as distribution, direct supply as the source of margin. I went looking for a flaw in that reasoning across 5 parts and 13 chapters, and I did not find one. It is a good plan. And the public evidence that any of it is actually being built scores 0 on both of the bars a technical buyer checks. 0 out of 12 on developer experience. 0 out of 9 on trust. That is the gap this study exists to describe. 4 conclusions. 1. The gap is calendar and execution, not insight. This is the most hopeful sentence in the study, and I want to make sure it lands. Everything in the Phase 1 and Phase 2 lists is weeks of work by people who are already employed. The documentation, the sandbox, the idempotency, the webhooks, the versioning policy, the published entry price, the crossover threshold between self-serve and sales. None of that requires a hire, a funding round, or a technology that does not exist. It requires a decision and about 6 weeks. The trust surface is the only item on the whole list with an irreducible lead time. SOC2 Type 2 has an observation window of 3 to 12 months that cannot be compressed by any amount of money. And it is the one item that has not started. The money was never the barrier. The calendar is the barrier, and it is the barrier the incumbent has already paid. 2. The comparator is the supplier. Ascenda publishes uptime for the API that HeyMax depends on. It publishes 66 pre-answered security questionnaire items besides, along with 143 documented pages, a trust center, SOC2 Type 2, and ISO 27001. The strategy this company has chosen depends on being faster than Ascenda in the mid-market. I believe that speed advantage is real. But until a mid-market buyer can complete an entire evaluation of HeyMax without booking a meeting, that advantage is theoretical. Speed that a buyer cannot access is not speed. 3. The customer list needs rereading before it is repitched. Roughly 9 paying platform relationships. Some marquee wins that are, structurally, capped promotional campaigns rather than contracts, and 2 of the 4 published propositions that are purchases rather than sales. I said this in the chapter itself, and I will say it again here, because it matters. That is not an accusation of misrepresentation. 9 paying relationships in under 3 years with 30 people is genuinely fast, and the campaign wins were hard to land. The problem is not the achievement. The problem is that the one number which would resolve the ambiguity, net revenue retention on committed accounts, is not currently measured. Without it, nobody inside or outside the company can tell a compounding business from a churning one. 4. Revenue is the wrong metric for this business. Marqeta is the proof. Its blended take rate fell about 75%. Its net revenue fell 32%. And its gross profit rose every single year, from $320 million to $437 million, with gross margin climbing from 43% to 70%. It booked its first full-year profit in the year revenue fell hardest. HeyMax should expect and plan for exactly that kind of compression. Charging less per mile while making more gross profit is the shape of the transition, not a failure of it. But there is a crucial caveat, and I will not soften it. Marqeta's margin expanded because its cost to serve is software, and software amortizes across volume. HeyMax's cost to serve is a mile bought from an airline. That cost is set by partners, and it has been rising. The marginal redemption cost is floored at 1.8 cents by HeyMax's own product, and partner costs have run as high as 3.5 cents. So the margin cannot come from scale alone. It has to come from direct supply contracts. That is why redemption supply negotiation is an infrastructure strategy problem and not merely a consumer product one. Now, what would prove this wrong? I owe you the falsifiers, because analysis that cannot be falsified is just opinion with citations. First, if HeyMax's business-to-business contracts turn out to be committed multi-year agreements rather than campaigns, then net revenue retention is above 100%, and the concentration analysis in Chapter 12 is simply mistaken. That is checkable immediately from contracts the company already holds. It is the first number I would ask for. Second, if a Tier 1 bank onboards without SOC2 because a coalition relationship or a regulator-adjacent relationship substitutes for the attestation, then the compliance calendar argument weakens considerably. The whole sequencing case rests on that report being a gate. Third, if the full loyalty stack wins a deal against Ascenda on features rather than on price, then my recommendation not to build it is wrong. And fourth, if the mid-market genuinely buys on relationship rather than on published artifacts, which is entirely possible in Southeast Asia in a way it is not in the United States, then the developer surface argument in this study is an American-shaped assumption imported into a market that does not run on it. Each of those 4 is testable within 2 quarters. Most of them are testable from documents already sitting in the building. Which brings me to the same place the previous study in this series arrived, and I do not think that is a coincidence. The company's strategy documents are consistently better than its instrumentation. The thinking is ahead of the measuring, and the measuring is ahead of the publishing. And the cheapest work available to this company, by a very wide margin, is simply to make what it already knows visible to the people it needs to convince. This has been an independent analysis, based entirely on public sources, with a live audit conducted on the 4th of August, 2026. Estimates and analysis are labeled as such, and nothing in it is financial advice. Thank you for listening.